My name is Quiana Chase, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. And a little bit about me and what I do. I'm a writer. I have one book published with Dramatic Press called My Brother is Human. And I also work at a spaceship simulator where like kids get to go onto these replica spaceships and get to act out a sci-fi story. And I get to be the person behind the scenes who's at the microphone, kind of leading all the story along and playing all the different characters. And a lot of it is like I do a lot of the story development for that. And also you just kind of have to put the story out there and come up with a lot of things on the fly. So that's my experience. We're going to go to our other panelists. Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Anne Chamberlin, and my 20th book just came out, and
wow.
I'm very interested in. I'm a little bit older than you are, Quiana, so I've been at this a long time. So I'm looking forward to talking about the Crucible, they're calling it. I must confess I had never heard it called that, but that's a good term for it. And I'll let Quiana take over.
Perfect. And we do have another panelist who may be joining us later. He was here and then he disappeared, but I really hope he'll be coming back. So the first question I have is, how do you know when the conflict in your story is cheesy or bad?
I hope you'll chime in with your own thoughts on this. I personally find a lot of conflict that I read is not. It seems very hackneyed to me and very where there's black and white. To me, that is. But I can appreciate that many readers and many viewers don't like to be upset by anything other than black and white. And I've known friends who have backed away from telling a story they wanted to tell because they said, I can't, it was based on real life and I can't really say who was the bad guy here. But to me that, or people will say, I know someone who actually doesn't like the movie Speed because he thinks the hero made too many mistakes, or the hero making even one mistake detracts from the hero for him. So I think there are ways, and if you're writing for younger audiences, you may have to modify the intensity of the elements you put in your conflict. That could happen too. So I think it depends, but I always like one of my beta readers, she said, you're always like this. You're always like this. She didn't like that. It's too much, like you're fighting it all the time. Well, yeah, I start with outrage and go from there. So that's
yeah. And yeah, I really liked what you said about how it will depend on your audience and who you're writing for, right? Because there are different audiences who expect different kinds of conflict. All the stories or missions that I fly for a variety of age levels. And if we're flying for a bunch of second graders, everything is very clear cut. Like they are supposed to rescue the scavenger aliens from the bad guy Crane, and Crane is just a bad guy, and they have to stop Crane, the bad guy, and that's just it. But as we get into like older grade levels, like even 5th or 6th grade levels, where they're like learning about the complexities of slavery and civil war, they'll often end up in a mission where they'll have to go against their mission objectives in order to do what they feel is right, and they'll find themselves on the wrong side of the conflict at times. We're like, wait, everything that we've done up to this point has actually been supporting an idea like slavery that I disagree with fundamentally, but I thought that I was doing the right thing, which is something we could never do with second graders. And there are people who really like value that black and white thinking and the black and white conflict because reading and is an escape for them, and they want to escape to that world where things are black and white and everything is so much clearer than it is in reality, where it is often a mix of swirls and gray and it's icky and gross. But there are a lot of audiences who like that, who like that seeping of complex issues into their stories because it helps them feel more real to them. And that's the kind of escapism they're looking for. Yeah, I really like that. Is there anyone in the chat who has any thoughts? Just go and type them in while Anne's talking.
Yes, she's able to read them and ask them at the same time as she's doing this. So I sort of but I once heard it was Moss is his last name. I can't remember the agent, and he gave a workshop that I attended, and he had us write down the first thing he gave us an assignment. Okay, write down one thing your protagonist would never do. Okay, so we wrote down, never do this. And then the next thing he says is, now I want you to put him or her in a situation where she will do it. And
I like that a lot.
Be required to do that. So that to me is very complex, and that's the kind of conflict I like. But I realize that it's often too much for people. But I think that my readers, if they came and I had more simplistic conflict, that's not what they come to me for.
Yeah, and I think that's important to like know your audience and write something that you know your audience would enjoy. And oftentimes your first audience is yourself, right? So if you're writing books that you enjoy, you're going to build an audience of people like you that like reading the kinds of things that you write. So it's okay if not everyone loves the kind of conflict you create, right? It's fine. Are there any
I think you pointed out an important thing, that you personally have to be able to go with this conflict and get excited about it and about working it out in order to stick with your topic for long enough to finish the book.
Yeah, because like you're your first audience, you're your first reader. Also, I don't know about the rest of you, but it's really hard for me to write things that I'm not invested in and things that I'm not interested in. So what kinds of conflict are like unique to different genres? Because you've written a lot of books. Are they all in the same genre or are they in separate genres? And if they are in separate genres,
I have in several different genres, mostly historical fiction, historical fantasy, and then a couple of sort of modern murder mysteries I've written, which I guess they have a little bit of fantasy in them. I think we can. You may have different ideas about this, but I think the fantasy and science fiction are very interesting in that the conflicts of the two are very different, even though they put them together. They're lumped together, and usually technology will solve any problem in science fiction, and in fantasy, it's more, magic is sort of this gut feeling control of your emotions as opposed to control of the technology. So that's the sort of difference in conflict that's there. Personally, I could say that every single book I've ever written has been a conflict of a woman with whatever culture she's living in. So I do a lot of historical fiction, and usually it's a patriarchal culture, and usually it is religion is involved. I mean, I can, I've done Joan of Arc,
Yeah.
and I've done, Adam and Eve, and King David, and these are the subjects that really attract me. That I can see that there's certainly a place for all other kinds of conflict, and I can appreciate them too.
Yeah. That's really cool. I liked what you pointed out about how the general like conflicts in sci-fi and fantasy tend to be different, and I think that's because, and this of course like is not consistent across the board, like you can shake things up in your stories and you'll find lots of stories that have shaken this up, but in fantasy I've noticed that fantasy novels are usually an allegory for a journey of an individual and self-realization and self-power, and even if there is like magic, it's usually an allegory for some sort of inner trait or inner realization, while sci-fi tends to be an allegory for society as a whole and society's progression or degression into certain aspects. And so a lot of the conflicts in sci-fi will often be centered on big societal problems and have societal solutions, while fantasy in general, it's all about the individual being able to fix things within themselves that eventually fix the world. That was
really good. That's really
yeah,
good, a good
and
description.
yeah, and I think that's why Star Wars is fantasy, because like nothing in there is really based off of science, and that's okay, but it's also all about self-actualization and like connecting to different aspects of your self and finding your own like personal power, which you don't really find in a lot of um big sci-fi stories.
Good.
Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so it looks like in the chat they're talking about a guy named Donald, is it Mass or Mace?
Donald Moss
Is an editor.
Yeah,
Moss, yeah.
the agent. He's the agent whose workshop I was in, where he said
Okay.
that.
Okay,
So
perfect. So, yeah,
thanks to the audience for reminding me about that.
perfect. Yeah, they're on top of it. And there's a workbook along that goes along with that as well for those of you who are watching the recording and don't have access to the chat. So, yeah, that's really cool. So, what are some examples of conflict that you've seen in media that has been really not good? And what are some telltale signs of conflict that's bad, I guess?
Well, I would say that this is very personal.
That's true. So, your personal preferences, I guess.
Yeah, because certainly I could say that, the things that come first to my mind are movies that were very popular and were and I'm thinking of a lot of adventure stories where, to me, body counts and 15 minutes hanging off a cliff. To me, this is not this is not the conflict that really grabs me, but certainly that's a conflict that is very attractive to other people. So I think it depends.
I think you're right.
Tell me what you think.
For me, the conflict that kind of like, I guess, irks me is conflict where it's I can tell that the writer made it up because they needed story to happen, and it doesn't feel like a natural consequence of the character's actions in the story. Like, I can't think of any like solid examples right now, just because if I see something that's bad, or read something that's bad, I'll just like roll my eyes and move on with it. But I'm sure like you've experienced something where you can tell that this conflict was there just because, you know, the author needed something to happen, and it doesn't feel like it was a problem created by the organic, I guess, like actions or desires of the different characters.
That's great. And I would say one thing, particularly in romance, I find this a failing is that, people know they have to have conflict. And mostly what it is, if the couple would just sit down and talk about it, all would be well. To me, a believable conflict is a little more than that.
Yeah. And of course, there are times where people just like don't sit down and they don't talk about it. But if it's like established that there are reasons why they don't sit down and talk about it, I feel like those work a lot better than if they just don't. Aha! Scott has joined us.
I'll
Hello.
tell you who I hate
Scott
right now. Technology.
That's conflict.
That's your
That
source
is
of
true
conflict.
Oh man, I'm all sweaty in February just sitting at my computer trying to get back
It's
into the room.
insane. I've had to like crack open windows and turn off the heat. It's insane. We have a comment that just popped up, and I think this is a really valuable thought. And Kate says, I think of Crucible as something that makes two people get stuck with each other rather than leaving, often in romance. Like, why can't she walk away? Why can't he go take the higher paying job? So what are your thoughts on makes people going despite having options? Do either of you have thoughts on that comment?
Go ahead. I'll jump in. I believe that circumstances, that goals tie protagonists and antagonists together to where they're stuck. The usual definition of the protagonist is someone who wants something, who is trying to accomplish something or overcome something. And the antagonist is someone who's trying to stop them from getting it. So depending on the genre, of course, if there's no bad guy, then sure, it can be John and Jane against the world, or John and Jane against circumstances and whatnot. But John doesn't hate Jane, and Jane doesn't hate John, right? But in a lot of other genres, there are very more definite bad guys, antagonists who are trying to keep the protagonists from doing something.
Yeah. And Scott, I want to ask you a couple questions, mostly because you were lost to the ether there for a little bit. But so would you mind introducing yourself a little bit and then telling us about an example of your favorite type of conflict that you've seen in a movie or a book?
My name is Scott Tarbet. I am a speculative fiction author. I do a lot of steampunk, science fiction. I've got a couple of novels. You can see a couple of them there behind me, and a bunch of short stories out there traditionally published. My conflicts tend to be rooted in the real world, either in our time frame or in a past or future time frame, but in our world and in our universe. And there genuinely are bad people in the world and bad forces in the world, and there are good forces and good people in the world as well. And so fictionalizing some of those conflicts is a deep well of conflict to be mined in things that have actually happened in people who have actually existed. And that's one of the reasons I do so much steampunk.
Yeah. Steampunk is really fun. It's one of my favorite genres. It's just a good party. Sometimes a depressing party, but like a good party.
Well, the reason that I don't consider it depressing, if I can take just a little bit of a swerve there, is that it allows us as the reader to wipe out the worst century in the history of mankind. It lets us erase the 20th century and go back to a time when technology was a hopeful thing. Technology was seen as possibly being the savior of mankind. It was going to raise all of the boats. And so in a lot of steampunk, the antagonist, the person that we love to hate is either someone who's trying to drag that viewpoint backward
Mm-hmm.
or is trying to accelerate it toward what actually did happen, which was world wars and genocides and computers which grew out of the world wars, atomic bombs which grew out of the world wars. And so those are fun people in a crucible that we already know.
I like that a lot.
That's really great, Scott. I'm very intrigued in that. That's I hadn't seen steampunk in that fashion before, but that's great.
Well, that I try and write all of my steampunk hopeful.
Yeah.
There are, I mean, I'm an old-fashioned novelist. I want my Act One sends a person up a tree. Act Two, I throw lots of rocks at the person in the tree, and Act Three, hopefully, I get the person down out of the tree.
But the tree is on fire.
But the tree's on fire, and there are alligators under the tree, and everything else.
Yeah. Do you have okay, hold on. I have a thought. I need to translate it into words.
The crystallizing.
Yeah, it's like buffering. What is the
my computer was for 10 minutes.
Yeah. What is the first sign to you that a conflict is poorly written? Like, what are some red flags that you see personally? And we talked about how audiences have different expectations. So this is just from your point of view, like what you like as an audience member.
The first thing I want to have is stakes. I want to have realistic stakes that I know from the first couple of minutes of the book or the movie or the play or anything else are realistic things that either the protagonist is striving for or is striving to prevent. And the way that I know that it's not well written is if I've got no skin in the game. If the writers have not given me a reason to care about their character, to care whether Jane gets together with John or not. If I don't care about Jane or John, they're just two more people, of which there are 3.5 billion pairs in the world. And why do I care? The conflict has to give me a reason to care.
That, yeah, and I think that spreads across all genres too. It's not just exclusive to one or two. Let's see.
Could I pose a question?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, just throw stuff in.
When do you come up first with a conflict? When you're looking at, your next work, do you come up with the conflict first, or what do you come up with first?
It changes a lot. Sometimes it's just a fun little situation that pops into my mind, or a fun character, or a fun setting, or a fun conflict. It could be any of those four things that happens first. But then, if the people who are listening have heard of the snowflake theory, then it's going to build out from there. But the first, pardon me if I use my work in progress right here. I've got a 70-year-old woman who is on a generational starship. Her consciousness is stored in the computer, and her complete genome is stored in the computer so that it can be 3D printed. And this generational starship goes from planet to planet at slower than light speeds, and she and her friends are printed, implanted, and sent down again. That's the high concept.
Mhm.
Okay,
Hmm.
there's a fun concept, but there's no conflict in that. So the story, without conflict, there is no story. There's an interesting situation. There's technology to explore, but there's no story there. Beyond I just told you the whole story as it would grow out of that initial high concept. But now,
So that
if
came
you
to
throw
you.
in
This came to you first as the high concept.
that, it came first as the high concept. If you're going to have true generational interstellar travel across a significant portion of a galaxy without creating faster than light speed, how do you do it? Do you send a bunch of people out to live and die generation after generation in a great wheel? Lots of writers have done that. Or do you send it all out in non-corruptible storage and it travels for 10,000 years and then it colonizes another planet, travels 10,000 more and prints and implants and colonizes another planet? High concept. But then you have to have a story other than just, and they went from one place to the next, and they went to the next. You have to have someone who's trying to stop her from doing what she's trying to do. The first antagonist in that particular story is herself, because she's 70 years old and she's been implanted into her 14-year-old body. And for those of us who already left puberty well in the rearview mirror, we wouldn't go back there for all the tea in China.
No,
it was a horrible time. So it starts with that conflict, and then it adds antagonists, multiple antagonists, and complicates the story and throws lots of rocks at Celia, who's up the tree, and lots of gators on the ground, and a whole swamp. So then all of that stuff has to be added to that concept. Here's another one that's a real fun one that I've recently completed. If I can do that, my daughter called me from Forks, Washington, where she lived early in the pandemic, and said, "Dad, Antifa is coming to burn down Forks." And I said, "They're what?" She said, "Yeah, the guy from the gun store in Squim called and said there's a busload of Antifa rioters coming to burn down Forks, Washington." And so I stayed on the phone with my daughter until she got calmed down. And it was a couple of hours before that obviously it was a rumor that was blown from nothing into something horrible. And then I sat down and wrote the story and made it into science fiction. And the antagonists in that story are the people of the town who think they're about to be burned down. And the protagonist is, and this almost actually happened. Well, the people of the town found a bus in the parking lot of the grocery store, an old broken down converted school bus, and they took the people prisoner that were in the bus. Real life, okay? In my concept, those were time traveling people who had come back to record the Olympic Peninsula, to make a VR of the Olympic Peninsula, and got caught up in the riot. Okay, very, very topical, but fun. A great nugget, not to wrap a whole novel around, but to write a 5,000-word short story about. And so the ideas come from everywhere. The concepts come from everywhere. Sometimes Celia, that 70-year-old lady in the 14-year-old body, is the seed. But there always has to be conflict added to wherever it comes from to make it real, to give it a story.
Really like that. And that is like some unique ways to implement conflict into your stories. So in a lot of so there have been millions of stories written, right? There are millions of stories and a lot of very set genres, and we'll often find that the stakes and the conflicts in those stories and genres are very similar to them, very similar to each other. They're usually like, world-ending things. You have person who wants to be with person B but can't, um, or there's a marginalized group who's being persecuted against. How do you make conflicts that are still relatable but also fresh and keep readers engaged?
And do you want to take that, or
Well,
is this a
ahead.
repeat question?
No,
Okay.
no, go ahead. That's a good question.
Okay. I don't want to talk too much.
I already have my turn.
The answer for me is that the antagonist has to be multidimensional. They can't be just the person who's being evil and mean for the sake of being evil and mean. That's not a believable antagonist. That person has to have their shades of gray, just like the protagonist has to have their shades of gray. In this book right here, it's called A Midsummer Night's Steampunk, and it's a steampunk retelling of the Shakespeare play.
My favorite one.
The two pairs of young lovers. One of the pairs of young lovers is young Winston Churchill and his future wife. And the big antagonist is Kaiser Wilhelm. So these are real people who really exist, who are, in the case of Kaiser Wilhelm, is literally out to conquer the world. And there's Winston Churchill, who's out to conquer the world. He fancies himself the guardian of the British Empire, which at that time had conquered a lot of the world and looked to conquer more. And so, talk about two people with shades of gray, and then you put.
So how do you make Kaiser Wilhelm have layers of being?
I'm more than happy to answer that question. Kaiser Wilhelm's mother was Queen Victoria's oldest daughter, and he was raised a good English boy until he was a tween, and then his father's advisors took him away from his mother to make a proper Teutonic knight out of him. And so the man lived his entire life with a lot of schizophrenic conflict in his own life. He was torn between two cultures. He and his British cousins were very close right up until the First World War, and even during and after the First World War. And so in this book, we give his mother the chance to go back and fix what she wasn't able to fix in his youth through steampunk means. So he's very relatable guy. We know from history that he is personally responsible for unleashing a lot of the horrors of the 20th century. The Holocaust can directly be added to his account. Atom bombs and digital computers can be tallied up to him. And so there's a lot of shades of gray with him as a real person. And you can do the same thing with every
That's great.
story you get.
I just read a book that was kind of it was a whole bunch of vignettes about a bunch of people who were in Vienna in the 20s, in one day in the 20s. And one of them, or maybe it's the early 30s, and one of them is Hitler. and you don't get his name at first, and you're kind of sympathetic to this guy because his teeth are so bad.
Mhm.
His teeth are hurting him, and he's trying, with his counselors, he's trying to get some way to present his message that will be good for the world, and I thought that was very well done.
Oh, a good writer can layer the
Yeah.
worst person. One of the reasons we love Hannibal Lecter so much, even though he's such a horrible, horrible character, is that we realize why he's a horrible character, what the factors are in his life that turned him into what he ultimately becomes. And so if you take any one-dimensional character and give them a backstory that explains why they're so bad, then they become someone we both love and hate at the same time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Keep going. I really liked what Anne talked about, and she brought up something that a different kind of conflict with her story about Hitler, where you didn't realize that it was about Hitler. Because when I first heard the name of this panel, I was thinking, oh, conflict between the characters in your story, right? But there's also a way to create conflict between the reader of the story and the reader of the story. So where you can provide those different layers where they're like, I don't know how to feel about these different characters and like who I should be rooting for. For me, the first experience that I had like that was when I read Killer Angels for the first time. Because like there were a lot of conflicting feelings there because I grew to adore all the soldiers that were and their personalities, the soldiers that were fighting for the Confederacy, and I really loved all the soldiers who were fighting for the North, but I really did not like what the soldiers in the Confederacy were fighting for, and it was really hard because like I didn't want them to die, but I didn't want them to win either. And there were also some people like it was so complex and it caused a lot of like tension in my soul, and it caused me to do a lot of like self-interrogation and self-reflection. So what are your favorite ways to create that conflict between the reader and themselves?
Anne? Or we
Well, I just want to say that's really great what you just said, Quiana. That's the kind of conflict I like best. But I can see that there would be people for whom they would not want to finish the book, because they
Yeah.
couldn't stand that. I really liked. This may be a little off topic, but since you brought up the war. The Civil War, I really like the Starbucks, Bernard Cornwell's Starbucks series, where he has the son of a Northern abolitionist who hates his father and goes to fight for the South. And so he's the guy you're rooting for. He hates his father, who's the guy you would usually be rooting for, and he gets a lot of good conflict that way. But it's interesting that his publisher told him to stop that series because he's a Brit, and Brits should not be writing about that kind of stuff and about the American Civil War. Anyway, it was I enjoyed that sort of conflict.
Well, I'm glad my publisher didn't tell me not to write about a story in England. One of my other whips is a story from the Anglo-Zulu War, told from the Zulu point of view. There are famous battles, and I'm just this morning, as a matter of fact, I was working into the text the reasons why the Zulus did to dead bodies what they did, and why they thought they were doing an act of mercy, and how they were following religion in opening the belly, in in performing the coup de grace, and they were acting morally within their own compass. You have to give more than one moral compass in order to have the reader give the reader fuel for thought that theirs is not the only moral compass in the world. That's one of the reasons I read, is to understand that not everybody's an old white guy, right? Not everybody is an old Christian white guy, certainly old heterosexual Christian white guy, right? There are all sorts of different moral compasses, and that's what literature is good for. Is good for laying those things open for us to think about and examine and profit from, grow from.
That's great. That's great, Scott. I remember that a reaction to a first scene I wrote where, so these two women discover a body of the guy who's been raping the younger, who's been sexually molesting the younger woman. And the first thing the two women do is sit down and have a drink. And I got comments that, how could you let that happen? Don't they go find the police? Don't they do something else? But no, in this case, it was time for a drink.
Yeah.
There's the kitty.
Yeah, I'm surprised she came to visit.
What if I told you a story about a little kid who's beaten habitually and severely by his father, who's driven to become what his father wants him to be, and just can't, enlists in his country's armed forces to fight what he thinks is an existential threat against his country. And then you find out you're talking about Adolf Hitler. Because all of those things are true of Adolf Hitler. He had a very different moral compass, one that most thinking people reject, but he had one. There were a lot of people beneath him who had no moral compass, whose only moral compass was profit and domination. But magnetic personalities like his always have a strong moral compass. Vladimir Lenin had a strong moral compass. Joseph Stalin had no strong moral compass. He was not a magnetic person. Any person, and this is I'd love to hear the countervailing theories on this, but I think every magnetic person has a strong moral compass, whether you like it or not. Whether you have a similar moral compass to Ronald Reagan or Martin Luther King, very different people. Jesse Jackson. I don't know, Quiana, if you know who Jesse Jackson was.
No.
and probably does, but very different moral compass. There are people whose moral compass right now, and this is one that I'm struggling to understand right now, whose moral compass is Donald Trump. I
will certainly say that the present situation gives us much. I don't even know if we can encircle it in fiction. I mean, it's a really difficult thing to do.
Not yet.
Yeah, but later it'll be like intense fuel, I think, for stories.
Absolutely.
So we have about 5 minutes left. There have been some really great comments. The most recent one came from Elena, I think that's how we pronounce it. And she says, I think with a book where you're trying to create a sense of dissonance within the reader, you have to be upfront about what the reader is getting themselves into. And even then, there will always be the reader who goes in with a passive mindset and won't look at it critically. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're writing those sort of stories, is to get to make sure that people like know what they're getting into. You have those expectations set up pretty quickly. So do we have any questions from the audience? I feel like I addressed most of them during the stream, but if there are any others, we could answer super quickly because we have like 3 minutes.
Elena, that was a great comment.
Yeah.
Gives great food for thought.
Okay, sweet. I think we're good to wrap it up then. So let's talk about, give our little send off and talk about where we'll be for the rest of the week and where people can find us and our work.
Where will I be? I have a couple of more panels to do tomorrow. I'm hosting another one on mining, of all things, this afternoon.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's a fun topic. I'm not doing any solo presentations this year in this format, but I'll be in and out and roundabout.
Sweet. What about you, Anne?
This is my last panel of the symposium. I've enjoyed it very much, and I will be around listening to other people when they do their panels. But I've really enjoyed working with you two, and I only wish I could have seen the audience and had more interaction with them. But this is great.
Agreed. This is my last panel for today, but I have a couple more panels and solo presentations tomorrow that you can check out. There's one about teen leadership and like the social dynamics that often come with that. That's a social presentation that'll be at, I think, 6 tomorrow. Yeah, that'll be in Tolkien, 6 p.m. I'm also basically live on Discord, and I'm sad that no one has contacted me personally, even though I say every single time, you can just contact me personally and I'll talk with you. It'll be fine. But I'll just be hanging out here. This has been a really fantastic panel, and I feel like there was a lot of excellent food for thought that I'm going to be digesting for a long time. You guys were excellent. So,
Thank
yeah.
You.
Well done.
Glad you finally joined us, Scott. It was great.
Yes. It was a pleasure. I'm really glad you made it.
Some conflict with the
technology. Sometimes I hate technology, but I'm stuck with it. I'm in the crucible with it.
In the crucible. There we go.